I did the thesis because just over a decade ago I did a big report on aged care for the Uniting Church, looking at the future. And what was interesting is that although the Uniting Church is the largest single player in aged care, the parishes that were involved with the oversight of aged care were actually in decline. And so I had done a master's degree in religious studies at the University of Sydney a quarter of a century ago, and I was invited to come back to do a PhD. So I thought this would be an excellent time. I took early retirement from Wesleyan Mission and used this as an opportunity just to look at where the Uniting Church had come from. I was involved right at the very beginning with the organisation of the original procession. So I was right there at the beginning. And so I was able to use this as an opportunity just really to explore where the Uniting Church has come from and why the hopes and visions and dreams that we had back in 1977 are now all crumbling. The research was drawn mainly from my own experience. So it's a different type of research from most PhD research, which is where people do the research from outside and then interview a lot of the participants. I'm an insider. So I was able to do it as a participant observer, as it's called, someone who's an observer but also a participant. So I'd sit at church meetings and just be making notes, etc. Plus I've got a host of my own documents. Everything that I use in the doctorate is in the public domain. There are no internal documents. Well, what I wanted to do with the thesis was to help the Uniting Church to look at why things are turning out sour and how we can actually look towards the future. It's not my job to predict how things are going to go. As a scenario planner, I'm simply providing 4 different scenarios. If I've done my job properly, one of these 4 scenarios will come into play. There are basically 3 ways of thinking about the future. One is prediction. So people make predictions about how the economy is going to go, what they're going to do this evening. A second way of thinking about the future is to have a vision and then to work towards that vision. President Kennedy in 1962 said that the Americans would put a man on the moon by 1970. That was the vision, and so it was necessary to build a bridge back from the future to the present. A third way of thinking about the future is to look at the possible futures, not what is being currently predicted, not what you'd necessarily like to see happen, but what could happen. And scenario planning is the technique to help people get a wider perception of the possibilities that could be emerging. Scenario 1 is called Word and Deed. So scenario 1 envisages a Uniting Church where it has an amalgamation of the congregations or parishes, bringing them together into a small number of large regional churches. And the regional churches would provide both the normal traditional church services, so to speak, but also a lot of the welfare services, and so would tender for government contracts, etc. So it would be probably the most familiar model of the 4 scenarios. In other words, a small number of larger churches with the amalgamations and the consolidation of the Uniting Church's resources. It was an easy scenario to do because it's the one that most people would feel comfortable with. In a sense, as someone who's worked for much of his time with Wesleyan Mission in Sydney, it's almost a case of devising a series of regional missions right the way across Australia. Second scenario sees the continued decline of the congregations. One of the predictions that you can make is that by just looking at the demographics of the Uniting Church, clearly the Uniting Church is in decline in terms of its congregations. But if you were to consolidate all the Uniting Church's resources and then put it in as a company on the Australian Stock Exchange, it would be larger than 90% of the companies quoted on the Australian Stock Exchange. So it's a multi-billion-dollar organisation, not so much because of what is being done through the normal traditional church service work, but through its welfare work. Aged care, it's the largest single provider of aged care. It's involved with childcare, homeless persons, etc. Consolidate all of that. So in this second scenario, what I call secular welfare, we see the gradual decline of the Uniting Church congregations, but we see the expansion of the Uniting Church's work in terms of social welfare. And so it will be, therefore, a Christian social welfare organisation. The third scenario I call the early church. So if you look at church history, we have, in the first 300 years, the early church was a struggling religious grouping in a larger Roman Empire. And then around the beginning of the 4th century, the Roman emperor converted to Christianity. And so we have this Constantinian era, which has flowed through from the 4th century through until until quite recently. Now, that's most churches think in that Constantinian era mindset, whereas in fact, if we were to go back to the early church, the early church model saw itself as a missionary church in a hostile, wider environment, seeking to win souls for Christ. And so in this third scenario, I foreshadow the way that you get some Christians who say, look, we're sick and tired of all the government regulations over social welfare. Let them go their own separate way. We will concentrate on saving souls. So we will concentrate on evangelism. We will devise our own home churches. So it's almost the form of the emerging church, cafe church, all these sorts of things that we already are experimenting with in the Uniting Church. And so what we would have, therefore, would be a small group of people using some of the assets of the Uniting Church, but focusing much more on evangelism and what people would see as the original purpose of the Christian church before it gets so heavily involved in receiving government money to provide social welfare. The fourth scenario I call recessional. In other words, it's just the decline of the Uniting Church. In other words, that we have a situation with the decline in congregations, but also perhaps we run into problems with the government funding of social welfare contracts, that perhaps we may fall out of favour with the government. There may be, for example, scandals, etc. And so we just see the gradual decline of the Uniting Church, in which case there has to be a clear exit strategy which will permit the flourishing parts of the Uniting Church to be able to exist on their own. Clearly, the Uniting Church schools, most of them, do extremely well. You've got some of the big Wesley missions, like the one in Sydney, doing well on their own. So they would be allowed to have a separate existence. Same with Uniting Church colleges on the university campuses. They would be allowed to separate out, but we would need to have an exit strategy that would deal with the rest of the Uniting Church and just let the rest of the Uniting Church gradually fade away. What I want to do as a document is to go around and explain how these four scenarios operate. So it's not the job of the scenario planner to make predictions or to identify a preferred future. Instead, it's simply to say these are the four scenarios. These are the warning signs that you must look out for. I've also developed at the end of the dissertation a communication strategy whereby the Uniting Church, if it wished, could emphasise, one, the fact that God is at work in the world. We must not judge the state of the Christian church by what we see in Australia or New Zealand or Great Britain. We have more Christians in the world than ever before. So one is to emphasise that God is very active in the world, and maybe good resources for the Uniting Church would be to assist where the church is growing rather than sit on the resources unused in this country. Secondly, to emphasise the pace of change at which the world is changing. And then thirdly, to encourage churches perhaps to reflect as a congregation or as a parish. I've drawn up a list of questions. What is going wrong with the Uniting Church? It has the most open and inviting membership approach of all the churches, and yet it does not manage to attract the members. It's doing its best, doesn't have the restrictions that some of the other denominations do, but it's failing. Is the congregation too focused on managing the present to think about the challenges of the future? How can the congregation communicate with younger generations? The Uniting Church has an increasing number of older people. They will be around for a long while, but they may not have the financial assets to keep the Uniting Church going. Are we just recycling the past, doing next year what we did last year? Why can't we amalgamate with another nearby congregation? If the Uniting Church did not exist, would we now bother to create it? Are we just too tired to carry on? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And finally, if this congregation closed down today, would the local community notice its disappearance? Would the community care? What I would like to do is to go around to speak to the various levels of the Uniting Church and say these are the four scenarios, these are the warning signs. We need to be thinking about contingency plans to cope with each of these warning signs. We need to be focused far more on the future and the threats and opportunities which are emerging, because each of the scenarios has opportunities. And we just need to be ready to grasp those opportunities. Certainly, we do have a declining membership, but there are still many other opportunities that are available.